Welcome back, everyone. We're diving deep today into how we can really get specific when talking about how often we do things in English,
Yep.
especially in routines.
Oh, yeah. It's a really interesting topic and can make a huge difference in how natural you sound.
Exactly. It's like one of those subtle things that native speakers do without even thinking about it. And guess what? Our source material is an episode from a podcast for people learning English.
Oh, cool. What kind of things do they talk about?
Well, they have this really funny dialogue about a woman's morning routine, and it's packed with insights. I mean, it's pretty elaborate, but that's what makes it so great for learning.
I can see that. A morning routine, everyone can relate to that in some way, right?
Exactly. Everyone has some kind of routine, even if it's super simple. So first, they kind of remind us what a routine is. Basically, it's just a series of steps you repeat regularly, right? Like, think about your own morning. You probably do things in a certain order.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, most people do. I know I do.
So the podcast dialogue they use, the character's name is Stephanie, and her routine is, well, it's a lot. Showering, taking care of her hair, getting dressed, and oh, of course, coffee, the essential.
It's pretty comprehensive.
Yeah,
And that gives us a lot to work with, right?
it does. So now they get into the nitty-gritty of it all. They talk about specific words called adverbs of frequency. These tell us, how often something happens.
Right, like frequently, seldom, often, usually, regularly. All those good ones.
Exactly. And using a diverse vocabulary like this, I mean, it not only makes your English more precise, but it also makes you sound more sophisticated. It's like one of those things that can really impress people.
Totally. It shows you have a real command of the language.
So let's get into some specifics from the podcast. They highlight that frequently means almost always, like maybe even more than 75% of the time.
Oh, wow. Okay, so it's really frequent. I mean, that makes sense.
Right. And then there's seldom, which is a beautiful word. It means something happens almost never.
I love seldom. It sounds so, I don't know, elegant or something, like something you'd read in a book.
Definitely. It adds a certain flair. Then they compare often and frequently. They're pretty similar, but often might be slightly less frequent, maybe around 70–80% of the time. And, they also point out something interesting about the pronunciation of often. Some people pronounce it with a clear T sound, while others kind of soften it.
Huh. I never thought about that. But I guess both ways are fine, right?
Oh, yeah, totally. Both are perfectly acceptable. And then we have usually, which implies something happens consistently, maybe around 60–70% of the time.
Okay, so it's definitely more than half the time, but not quite as much as often.
Right. And then there's regularly, which means something happens quite often, but maybe with a few exceptions. It's like slightly less frequent than usually.
So like if you said, I regularly exercise, it means you do it often, but you might skip a day here and there.
Yeah, exactly. See, these little distinctions are so helpful. Instead of always relying on just always or sometimes, you can really fine-tune what you're trying to say, make your English more nuanced.
It's all about being specific and using the right word for the right situation. And it makes your English more interesting, too.
Absolutely. Now, get this. The podcast doesn't just stop at single words. They also highlight phrases that convey frequency. So every day obviously means 100%, no exceptions.
Yeah.
But you can still add nuances like almost every day or every day except Sundays.
Oh, right. That makes sense. Like if you wanted to highlight those exceptions.
Exactly. Then you have phrases like every other day or every second day, meaning you do something on alternating days.
So like Monday, Wednesday, Friday kind of thing.
Exactly. And we can't forget every now and then and from time to time. These are great for those things we do, occasionally, not super often.
These are great alternatives to just saying sometimes all the time.
They are. And the podcast uses these phrases to talk about things like how often Stephanie, from the dialogue, washes her hair or picks out her outfits.
So they're showing how we actually use them in conversations.
Yeah. Now, Stephanie's routine actually gives us some other fun vocabulary, too. Like, she talks about blow-drying her hair. So that just means using a hairdryer to style your hair, whether you want it straight or curly.
Okay, pretty straightforward. What else?
She also mentions using a flat iron, which is that heated tool people use for straightening and smoothing hair.
Oh, yeah, I've seen those.
Yeah.
And then, of course, she mentions frizz, that unruly, puffy hair that can be a real problem, especially when it's humid.
Exactly. So she regularly uses a flat iron to keep her hair from frizzing.
Makes sense. I love how they're using her hair routine as an example of how we can combine these different adverbs and phrases in real-life situations.
Me too. And it's not just about isolated words. It's about seeing how they all connect and work together naturally.
Absolutely. And that's how we learn to sound more like native speakers.
Right. Right. Okay, one last vocabulary point from this part of the podcast. Stephanie mentions brewing a pot of coffee. Now, that's a little different from just a cup of coffee, wouldn't you say?
Oh, yeah, definitely. A pot of coffee usually means a larger quantity, enough for multiple cups, like brewed in a coffee maker. It's a common thing, especially in homes with more than one coffee drinker.
It's definitely a cultural thing, too. And then, of course, they tie this back to routines, saying how coffee plays a big role in a lot of people's daily rituals.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. And I think this is a good point to transition to how we can apply these concepts to other areas of our lives. It's not just about morning routines, it's about how we talk about the frequency of, well, anything.
You're so right. It's time to move beyond Stephanie's elaborate routine and see how these adverbs and phrases work in a wider context. What about, like, your work week? Do you always get to work on time? Or do you frequently stay late?
These adverbs can make you sound a lot more professional, right?
Exactly. It's all about having the tools to paint a vivid picture of your life, your habits, everything.
And these adverbs of frequency are essential tools for doing that.
I think we've covered a lot of ground already, but I have a feeling there's still so much more to explore when it comes to expressing frequency in English.
Oh, for sure. And the more we dig into it, the more we uncover about this amazing language. And it's amazing how these seemingly simple concepts, like how we talk about how often we do things, can be so complex.
Seriously. And the podcast does a really great job of showing how to use these adverbs and phrases naturally, like in real conversations.
Oh, yeah, they actually have the hosts themselves describe their own morning routines at the end.
Yeah. It's almost like a mini lesson in conversational English.
For sure. One of the hosts says he always brushes his teeth right after waking up and usually makes a pot of coffee.
Right. But then he's like, sometimes, if I'm running late, I'll just grab coffee at the office.
So relatable. And he also mentions that he seldom picks out his clothes the night before, almost always in the morning.
That's interesting. I wonder if that's a common thing.
I don't know, but it's cool how he mixes those single-word adverbs with the phrases we were talking about earlier. It just sounds so natural.
It does. And then the other host jumps in and talks about her routine. She's like, I generally ride my bike to work.
Oh, nice. But not always, right?
Right. She clarifies that she seldom bikes during the winter, and every now and then, if it's a nice day, she'll brave the cold.
I love that. They're using all these different ways of talking about how often they do things. It's so effortless.
I know. It's really inspiring. It's like they're weaving a tapestry of language, using these adverbs and phrases as the threads.
It really shows how mastering those little things can make your English so much more engaging and dynamic.
And, one thing they emphasize is the importance of putting all this knowledge into practice.
Of course. It's one thing to listen and understand, but you got to actually use it.
Right. They even give you some questions to think about, like, do you always make your bed? Or do you frequently skip breakfast?
Those are really good examples of how to ask about routines using adverbs of frequency.
Yeah, they are. It's subtle, but it makes a difference.
Totally. And even though this podcast is focusing on morning routines, you can apply these adverbs and phrases to so many other parts of your life.
Oh, absolutely. Think about your hobbies or how often you exercise, even your social life.
Right. How often do you do certain things? It makes you think.
It really does. And if we zoom out a little bit, we're basically talking about a core part of how we communicate, how often things happen.
Which is something we do all the time in so many different situations.
All the time. Like you could say, I regularly go for runs, or I often cook dinner at home, or I seldom watch TV.
Exactly. There's so many possibilities.
And as you get more comfortable with these words and phrases, you'll naturally start using them more and more.
It's like you're adding more tools to your language toolbox, giving you more ways to express yourself.
I love that analogy. So let's shift gears a bit and think about things we do weekly or monthly. Do you frequently visit museums, or do you seldom go to the movies?
It's funny, when you start thinking about how often you do things, you realize a lot about your own habits and patterns. It's like self-reflection through language.
That's a good point. You might realize you rarely make time for certain things, or that you're doing too much of something else.
Exactly. It helps you understand yourself better.
I like that. Okay, so we've talked about morning routines, work habits, leisure activities. What else can we use these adverbs for?
Well, we often talk about frequency in relation to our goals. Like I'm consistently working towards a promotion, or I'm diligently saving for a vacation.
Using those specific adverbs really adds something to your statement.
It shows you're serious about it.
For sure. Okay, let's try a specific example. Imagine you're learning a new language. How would you describe how often you study?
Well, I could say I diligently study every day, or I seldom miss a study session.
Or like I generally study 3 times a week, or I occasionally take breaks when I need to.
Exactly. And each adverb paints a slightly different picture of your learning habits. Diligently sounds very committed, while occasionally suggests you're more flexible.
It's amazing how those little word choices can change so much.
Right. It's about choosing the words that really reflect what you mean.
As we get better at expressing frequency, our communication becomes more clear and more engaging.
It's like we're fine-tuning an instrument so we can play a wider range of notes.
Beautiful analogy. Okay, so we've covered a ton in this deep dive, from those individual adverbs to how we actually use them in different situations.
From morning routines to goals to even language learning, it's been a journey.
It has, and we've seen how mastering this idea of expressing frequency can help us communicate so much better.
It's about taking those simple words and phrases and really using them to create a rich picture of our lives.
So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I'd love to hear from you, our listener. How do you use adverbs of frequency in your own life? What are some of your favorite expressions?
Yeah. Share your thoughts with us on social media. Let's keep this conversation going.
It's amazing how much we've uncovered just by talking about how often we do things.
I know, right? Even like the most ordinary stuff becomes interesting when you start thinking about how often you actually do it.
Exactly. Like, think about how many times a day you check your phone, or how often you actually make your bed, Little things like that.
It's true. Those little habits say a lot about us. And the way we describe them using those specific adverbs and phrases, well, it adds another dimension.
It's like painting a more complete picture of ourselves.
Totally. Oh, and remember Stephanie's hair care routine from that podcast. They actually explain some of those words, which is really helpful.
Yeah, it is. Like, they talk about blow drying hair, which is just using a hair dryer to style it, whether you want it straight or curly. And then there's flat iron, which is that tool people use to straighten and smooth their hair.
And of course, they mention frizzy hair, which is that, unruly hair that gets all puffy, especially when it's humid.
Right. And by explaining these terms, it's almost like they're giving us a peek into hair care culture. It's like a little cultural lesson tucked inside a language lesson.
That's a great point. Language is so much more than just words. It reflects our customs, our experiences, everything.
Absolutely. So what does this all mean for you, our listener? Well, you now have a whole new set of tools to talk about frequency, routines, and even hair care in English.
We've covered adverbs like frequently, seldom, often, usually, regularly, and phrases like every other day, every now and then, and from time to time.
And we've seen how you can use them to describe all sorts of things, from your morning routine to your work habits to what you do for fun.
But remember, it's not just about memorizing these words. It's about really understanding when to use them and making them your own.
Exactly. That's what helps you sound more natural and confident. And I know it might feel like a lot, but trust me, the more you practice, the easier it gets.
Think of it as a journey, not a destination. There's always more to learn in the world of language, and that's what keeps things interesting.
I couldn't have said it better myself. So keep exploring, keep practicing, and most importantly, have fun with it. That's all for today's deep dive, but your language learning journey continues. We'll see you next time.